Hello fellow plant lovers. So today I thought I'd do a bit of an off-the-cuff video here. I'm just going to make it up as I go along and tell you the story of my evolution with orchid watering and orchid root rot. So if you live in a country similar to mine where you have big long winters and pretty cool springs and autumn times, of course summertime everything's fine, but during the rest of the year that's when we tend to have problems with orchid root rot. This country couldn't have been more designed for rotting orchid roots. So what I thought I'd do is go through the various stages of my thinking and my development in the care for my orchids. So let's get started. And we are in. So what I'm going to do is just kind of chat as I point to various things. Some things might be relevant that I'm pointing to, like for example this Dracula chimera. I never know how to pronounce this thing, and this one does seem to be particularly suited to a cool growing environment like my greenhouse. So obviously I'm not talking here about every single orchid, but my goodness, I've definitely had more than my fair share of orchid deaths. So things like the Dracula, which I've just shown you, other cooler growers like of course the Masdevallias, don't have a problem with those. So I'm being very general here. I'm going to be very general with what I'm talking about. I'm talking about orchids like dendrobiums, Dendrobium cuthbertsonii. I don't know, these aren't warm growing orchids, but I've still had lots of root rot with them. I've had Miltoniopsis die on me. I've had Oncidium twinkles die on me. I've had several, I think I've had two actually, of the beautiful Nellie Isla orchids. Absolutely love those. Are they Oncidiopsis now? You could make an argument for saying that just treat them as a bunch of flowers. They're going to last longer. In my care, they tend to last at least a year. And then, as what usually happens with these things, you get it round to autumn, things start to go a little awry, get it through to winter and springtime. And then by the time springtime's come, they give up the ghost. Oncidium twinkles, another one, if I didn't mention that. I've got a whole list. I've spent so much money and lost so many orchids. And I can guarantee that the time that they die is after a long winter. That's when the problem comes. So why is that? Well, of course, the majority of orchids, even if the cooler growing orchids, tend not to like to have their roots in a particularly cool, wet environment. I know there are exceptions, but I'm talking about these ones that have died on me. Obviously, if they're still alive and they're still thriving here, then they're not quite as bothered about that. They don't mind it quite as much. I've had fewer orchids die on me, although I must say not totally without casualties, but I've had fewer orchids die on me when I had the warm side of the greenhouse, which was over there of course. Now I've got the hot house, it's in a warmer environment, the fluctuations aren't quite as much, well in fact they're nowhere near as much as they are in the greenhouse, so maybe that will make a difference. But I think a lot of my problem is the media in the pot and the pots and how I've dealt with that, how I've watered them and so on. So I'll take you through an evolution of it. So if you are used to living in somewhere like the UK and you were a gardener and you pot things up outside, you'll be more familiar with potting things up like you might pot a Streptocarpus up with some multi-purpose compost, maybe a bit of perlite, done, that's it. And your main problem really is to make sure that you water it and you don't forget about it. That is really all there is to watering something in a temperate climate. But when it comes around to orchids, because they're not used to that and they're epiphytic plants, they like loads of ventilation, loads of air, and they don't want those roots to be kind of constrained in something like a multi-purpose compost. So the first development in my evolution of orchids, bear in mind up to 3 years ago, well it's actually less than 3 years ago, up to about 2 point whatever years ago, I'd never grown an orchid in my life. So my first foray into it was to use an opaque pot and stick it in multi-purpose compost, which of course it didn't like and it died. So that was my first idea. Moving on, I then learnt a little bit from the internet, probably from 1 or 2 orchid YouTubers, as well as reading a few blogs. So the next development was to put it in a transparent pot so that you can see what's going on, of course. and to use something like just a coarse bark, not necessarily a thick bark, like almost like a fine grade bark. Well, no, not really fine grade, a medium grade bark, I would say. So I put all my orchids in medium grade bark, thought that would sort the problem. Did it? No, still had root rot. So what did we do next? Well, next we started putting holes in pots like this. Several holes, in fact, and I've still not totally finished on that journey, because I actually put more and more holes in. Every time I pot up or repot an orchid, I put an increased number of holes in that pot to try and increase the airflow. So what was the next stage? Well, the next stage after that, because I still had root rot, oh, by the way, the kind of bark I was talking about is this. So it's like a medium grade bark, and this is still in a medium grade bark and doing okay. But not all of them, you know, some of them still, the pots still are not drying out. And this is the issue. When it comes around to summer, there will not be an issue. Once the temperatures in this greenhouse are high enough and I've got all the doors and windows open, the ventilation is sufficient, that more closely resembles what they would get in a tropical place. We are not tropical here, and this is mainly the problem, isn't it, of course? So what did we do then? More holes in pots. We've now got the medium grade bark, but I was still getting root rot and I was still not allowing those pots to dry out. So what's the next step? Well, you could say maybe you should water less. So I've tried various ideas with the watering. I very often used to just pour through. I've got a trug here full of the orchid mix, and I would just pour through with a glass or with a cup. But what did that do? Well, during the summer, great. During the winter, still left the pots saturated. So I tried soaking them. I tried leaving them in between with greater lengths. You know, leave it for a week, leave it for a couple of weeks, see what would happen then. So I knew they were drying out, but of course then you get desiccation, and you get desiccation in the pseudobulbs, and you get desiccation in the canes. So this particular orchid here, which does have a few spikes on it now, so this one, Prostechia radiata. So this one is a really good indicator. It's like a litmus test for me, because these pseudobulbs very easily start to wrinkle up. So I know that one's doing okay if they're all nice and plump like that. So what was happening was, because watering by pouring them through, because that was leaving the pots saturated during winter and they don't dry out, I was leaving it longer in between waterings. What happened? We got desiccation. So that was no good. So the next step after that was, okay, well, if leaving them for a long time is not going to work, let's leave them a long time, but then let's soak them overnight and see what happens then. Well, yeah, it worked in as much as it did really plump those up, and it actually did a really good job of plumping up something like this Coleogene over here, which I've never had bloom, by the way. I'm still waiting for that to bloom, but I kind of know why now because of the way I was treating it. So soaking them was good in as much as it plumped up the pseudobulbs, but what did it do? Well, in the pots it still left saturation, it left wet, it left moisture, and at this time of year we've got the same problem in that the moisture was not drying out. So that was no good. So we then moved on to using some coconut husk, and you can just see some down there. Now that's a fairly fine grade coconut husk, and I've tried that with a number of orchids, and I think there is an improvement, but for a lot of my orchids, not enough improvement. So I've now moved on to this really thick coconut husk. This is larger grade coconut husk, and I believe with coconut husk it holds on to water in a slightly different way. It certainly has lots of gaps and air spaces between the individual coconut husks. So let's see what that does. That's where we're up to now. So for a lot of orchids, when I'm coming round to actually repotting them, I'm using the larger grade coconut husk. In some cases, I'm even just putting a little bit of sphagnum moss underneath where the new roots come, because of course new roots on orchids come at the base of the pseudobulbs, and that can be where I'm not getting the water to. So my latest method to try and overcome this issue, really, it's an issue of finding the balance, isn't it? It's finding the right balance for everything between the watering, the frequency of watering, how much water you give them, the pot that you use, the media that you use, the amount of ventilation you put in the pot. All this is very specific, not just to the actual plant, but to where the plant is. So my solution to it might not be the same as your solution, but in just talking it through, it will help me, and hopefully it might help somebody out there as well. So my latest solution to, or latest attempt to solve these issues is to do a little and often watering regime. So I'm actually using a pump action sprayer. There's my pump action sprayer down there, and I'm spraying into the top of the pots. So wherever there might be some new roots coming, hopefully they will actually get the water that is needed without completely saturating the entire pot. So whether this will solve the issues, it remains to be seen. And obviously we are in April now, the warmer the temperatures get outside, the less of an issue it becomes, and all orchids tend to grow, or all of my orchids that I have here tend to grow better. Of course, the cooler ones then, like the Masdevallia and the Dracula over there, will begin to suffer a little bit. But so far, you know, I've got areas in the greenhouse that's shaded enough that they've been okay. They were okay last year and the year before. It's just for the majority of the orchids, the majority are happier in the warmer temperatures. So I thought I would just go through that kind of evolution with you and see what you felt about this. I know this isn't something that everybody will be dealing with, and maybe if you're growing yours in the house, or in fact, definitely if you're growing yours in the house, you're not going to have the exact same issues that I'm having, because you're likely to have warmer temperatures. This is very specific really to the fluctuations in a greenhouse, because everything in a greenhouse fluctuates wildly, and the orchids don't like this. You know, I can think of nothing that doesn't fluctuate wildly. Probably maybe the humidity might be something that is roughly the same for most of the year, but if I do get some really warm weather, you know, the sun only has to come from behind a cloud and the humidity will drop like a stone, of course, as soon as I open all the windows as well. But for the most part, the humidity is fairly even. Everything else though fluctuates quite a lot. I can warm a greenhouse up, but I can't cool it down, and that can be a big problem as well. The lighting levels fluctuate quite wildly as well. This is one of the characteristics of being in a greenhouse. It's good in many ways, but it does have some downsides. So maybe you can tell me, would you have done anything differently? How would you deal with this situation? If you live in a country that has a similar climate to what we have in the UK, or if you're just growing your orchids in a similar way, or even if you are just having similar problems for different reasons, we've all got to try and come to terms with how to grow these plants if you're not actually in a tropical place. If you're in a tropical place, if you're in Florida, I'm sorry, you do not have these problems, but I'm sure you have other problems. So it's all about us trying to create a false environment for these plants, and unless you're growing the exact same genera, you're going to have to try and adapt conditions or adapt your care for that plant. So what I would like to know, if you could tell me in the comments, would you have done anything different to me? Do you have similar problems? How do you cope with those problems? What do you do? How do you do your watering? How do you decide on the pots, the airflow, the media that you're going to use, the amount that you're watering, how you deal with these problems? I would like to know. So if you could write that in the comments, that would be brilliant. Let's start the discussion off. So I think that will do for now. And if you're interested in growing begonias, which are far easier for people in a country like mine, then I suggest that you go and watch this video here. And that's it for now. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.